Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. Depending on where you are in your day, maybe it's morning, afternoon. My name is Adam Cherubini. I work at a company called ProNavigator. For those of you that don't know ProNavigator, we're a startup in the knowledge management information space, helping organizations manage information and the challenges associated with that. I I'm really excited about the topic that we have today, this notion of buy versus build. I think it's an incredibly important topic for every organization, large or small, trying to ascertain as an organization, trying to be at the leading edge of where technology is headed. Do you build it internally or do you buy? And that's what we're here today to discuss. I have with me just a great panel to help discuss and talk about this topic. I thought I would introduce everybody really quickly, and then I think we can just jump right into it and talk about this very important topic of, how do organizations go down the right path of onboarding technology. With me, I have Joe Emerson. He's a co-founder and CTO at Branch. Also, Josh Fishkind has joined us, and his title is the head of innovation at Axis. And certainly not last or least is Nick Lamparelli. And thank you, Nick, for co-hosting this with us. He is the managing partner at Insurance Nerds. So without further ado, I thought I would kick things off today, maybe with just a little bit of a framework as to how should organizations just even think about, setting the stage for making a decision about buy versus build. How do you create those rules of thumb or the principles around determining a buy versus build strategy? Joe, I don't know if you could kick things off on this kind of overarching philosophy, but how do you think about it? I mean, you're at a very dynamic organization. I'm sure you're making these decisions every single day. Do you have any kind of rules of thumb or how you balance the notion of buy versus build?
Yeah, I certainly do, and I think that the background that I think the philosophy has to live in my experience, and this is both in the startup world and in the enterprise established company world, is that on the one hand, there is now today more better, more wonderful software we can buy than we've ever been able to before. And on the other hand, we all have teams of people whose job it is to build software, and they get paid to build software, and they like building software. And they generally have formed identities and sense of self around building software. Builders want to build. And so it's important to understand when you're developing a philosophy or rule of thumb that the scale is tilted toward build. Almost always, you've got a team of people in your organization who are slightly worried every time you buy that they're going to lose their jobs, and who feel less good about themselves if they don't get to build something that could be built that they want to build. And so in that case, what we do at Branch and what I generally recommend is to think about what as an organization, what as a business differentiates you. What is special about you? What is your special strategy? And then if there is a way you can build that will further differentiate you or implement your differentiation or enhance your differentiation, then you should build. But if not, you should buy. And now sometimes you might say, well, I can't buy it. You should be skeptical. You can probably buy it. And so that's our rule. Our rule of thumb is if it's differentiated, if it's part of what we're trying to differentiate ourselves, how we're differentiating ourselves in the world, we should build it. If not, we should buy it.
Yeah, and I think that's a great starting point. And I wonder, Josh, is that kind of how you see things at Axis, that if there's real IP, if there's something definitively strong about how you're going to compete in the marketplace, you'll endeavor to build. Otherwise, go buy it. There's lots, as Joe said, there's probably an option for every single buy decision that you might want to make. Is that a similar philosophy that you guys have at Axis?
Yeah, I'd say Joe really nailed the issue, which is we all hire phenomenally talented people whose passion it is to build software. So to do the analysis, you know, it's one of the difficulties is you say, okay, we're paying this team of talented people a good amount of money, and they say they can build it. Why do we want to sign $1 million a year software licensing deal for something that, our team is capable of building? There's a lot of analysis that needs to go into that. Ultimately, the differentiation strategy is threshold question one. If it's not going to differentiate you, if this is just a tool that you need, I don't know any CTO, no matter how much they like building, who's going to say, let's build our own version of Microsoft Word, right? That would just be a really
Mhm.
silly thing to do. But when you start getting a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more nuanced, you end up with a scale of it's a total commodity, we should buy it, versus it is in the differentiation factor. And somewhere along that line is where those decisions get a lot more nuanced as to, how tailored is it to our business? Well, if we did build it, is it 20% more effective? What does it solve that edge case we always seem to run into? That's where we really end up with some challenge.
Yeah. Thanks. Nick, I assume you've seen this in your travels as well through different organizations and all the people that you come in contact with. Is it really setting that, a good foundation for buy versus that you can have repeatable again and again and again in terms of these decisions? I know it's not static, but maybe at least a starting point for decision making of buy versus build. Do you think that really does help set the organization on the right path
Yeah,
for this?
yeah, I think differentiation is the key word, honestly. And I know we're just sort of starting to scratch at it that there is more to this. I think we're going to go into total cost of ownership and elements like that. But I think differentiation just kind of stands on its own from a business strategy standpoint. Like what makes you different? What makes you special? Right. And if you're struggling to answer that, that becomes a problem in and of itself, regardless of buy versus build. It's, our is our solution a commodity, right? Can this solution stand out in the noise that exists in the marketplace? And I think that's what we're going to be going into. But I think as a starting point, I almost think you could use differentiation in almost every single complex question, dilemma that occurs in an organization and say, does this make us different? Does this make us special? Does this separate us? Does this make us stand out? I think differentiation by itself is probably a good pillar to build a business strategy and answer a lot of these different questions, not just buy versus build.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And by the way, that has been absolutely my approach throughout my career as I've thought about onboarding technology. If this is going to be a true differentiator, something that's going to allow us to compete in a differentiated way, then maybe you should own it and have the team go build it. I thought there was an interesting thing that came up, and Josh and Joe, you both touched on it. This idea about talent and there's so many different aspects of technology being built, and obviously with AI and where that's going. I'm wondering, Josh, do you think that one one advantage of buying is that you almost get kind of an extension of talent within your organization that you can't hire for every single thing you want to build over time. And maybe once you identify an area that's critically important to your organization, you may not have those resources today. Maybe you endeavor to in the future, but can buying help you bridge that gap from a talent perspective in the short term? Or do you think and not think of it that way? Do you think, hey, if it's that important, we'll go hire the people, but then does that delay it? And is buying actually a path to kind of an extension of talent?
Yes, it's a really interesting question. Most insurers, I think, have a relationship through their IT departments with an Accenture or an EXL or some third-party development service. And really, that relationship becomes very much like employees. As much as they're contractors, they become valuable team members. a good relationship with a vendor that is providing a technology that becomes core to your infrastructure that you're evolving together, where you become a stakeholder and you go to those quarterly meetings and you talk about what the trajectory is. Yeah, there can be that same level of collaboration. And I'd also say you benefit from a culture that may not exist within your own organization. Nowhere in the entirety of Axis is there a nap pod to be found. We do not have beer Fridays. That is not the insurance company culture, right?
Yeah.
But there is something to that in the way that it helps people think and innovate and create. And that exists in the software world. So if you want to get that, hey, I had this great idea and I had the freedom to execute and explore something new, you're probably not going to get that in a core insurance company environment. You do get that when you partner with tech companies who are building for the insurance company environment. So you're kind of getting the best of both worlds.
Yeah, interesting. Have you seen that dynamic, Nick, where you can almost learn from partnerships and vendors that you know, through their talent or through the way they do things, that then can come back and be core to the way that you do things internally? You know, just the idea of even how they build it,
Mm-hmm.
the talent they use to build it can be actually informative to, well, how would you actually do it moving forward? Because you're not kind of always operating in a vacuum then, I guess.
I think those ultimately become the best relationships where, you know, when I'm advising B2B firms, I'm telling them, Adam, to do exactly that, that to bring something of value beyond just how you're monetizing your particular solution, bring bring an element to the table. Because as you mentioned, Adam, this is a more abstract, deeper pain point for some firms, right? So they may have, resource limitations on the number of software developers and staff that they can possibly have. So there's also probably a limitation to the culture that can be developed there as well. And for a B2B firm to extend their best practices, their culture, especially when they're really good and really confident about what it is they're doing, that's by osmosis. That's like that rubs off on other firms. Like you see how they're delivering a particular project on time, under budget, and it's just, few bugs, just phenomenally executed, and there's something to learn there, right, as well. So I think those ultimately become the best partnerships, is where you're not stepping on each other's toes, but you're making each other better beyond just the transactional thing that's occurring.
No doubt. And Joe, I know you guys are still relatively young, but do you see that as a accelerant to your business? Not only do you maybe access talent, but can it translate into maybe speed too, versus building it yourself? If you kind of tap into this talent base, tap into somebody that's doing something really well, you learn from it, plus you get the advantage of the technology being deployed and your business becomes more competitive. Is that a dynamic that you actually see, by buying, if you will, versus building?
Yeah, we about 18 months ago, I felt like we needed to figure out what we are going to do on our AI strategy. And so we found a Y Combinator company that had, two founders, and we said, "You want to get into insurance? We'll open the door. We'll make time for you constantly, and you charge us nothing, but we'll introduce you to lots of other carriers, and we'll give that to you." And so they've been, basically we've had a very low cost, and we've run 20 different pilots. We've got 4 different things in production, and we haven't ever had to have anybody learn internally, like, what's a transformer, what's RAG, like, none of that has had to have been an internal skill. It's been really helpful. It's been especially helpful as, over the past 18 months, things have changed in kind of unexpected ways. I think that, people weren't expecting, I think, having like Facebook's model be basically free to use and so fast and so good, for example. And I think that, you could have done a lot of stuff on off OpenAI, but, I think there's a lot of interesting things there that as an organization, you would never be as nimble. But I also want to highlight, and I think the most important thing that's useful to know about Branch here is that there's also an inverse part of this problem you're talking about, which is that we can focus on what differentiates us: name and address, findable price, find a bundle in a single transaction, home, auto, umbrella in 60 seconds. like that's the differentiator we've focused on and we leverage. And outside of that, everything else is a distraction. And so we don't have Kubernetes, for example. If anyone's ever heard of Kubernetes, I promise you, your customers don't care if you know how to use Kubernetes internally. And what it's enabled us to do is to have a much smaller development team. So our development team is about 13 developers right now. So that's like 6 products, 37 states. Every other kind of insurance startup in this same dimension is, well into the hundreds of developers. And imagine how much, faster you can go and how much less you can spend if your focus is like, let's just do the thing that differentiates us. Let's work on speed to our solution, and let's just make sure that everything else is just handled by vendors.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Adam, can I add something there? Because I think there's such an important lesson, right? It's when Joe said we haven't had to have the AI expertise. And that I think that has to be part of the calculus. We're seeing this experiment in real time with AI. Joe's just gone through it. Josh, I'm sure your team speaks about this all the time. I'm seeing this discussion almost every single day around AI, and that is a very unique skill set. And it's very expensive to acquire as well. So even as Joe said, I think you almost have to be fanatical about what it is that you're going to go after, because that AI carrot, that 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 shiny thing that can kind of grab your attention. Yeah, it's exciting. It's really interesting, but ultimately it's going to be really expensive because you're competing against the Silicon Valley firms, the gigantic banks. You're competing with all of them for that AI talent, and that's going to be hard to maintain. So it's fun and it's shiny now, but it's going to be difficult. And I appreciate firms that truly understand, like, this is what we do and this is what we're going to completely focus on. This is the differentiator. And so everything, including whether we buy or build, all of those decisions around there have to wrap around and fit into that jigsaw puzzle that is our differentiator. I think that's an important part of the calculus, is how expensive is it going to be ultimately to buy something or to build something.
Okay, I got to jump in on this one. So this is a topic that's on my mind all the time. So if we would have been having this conversation 18 months ago, we would have been saying, how is blockchain going to change the entire insurance industry, right? Or maybe 2 years ago. And I am sure there are a lot of companies that spend a lot of money on very high-end blockchain experts who are going to build out all of our insurance contracts on Ethereum. Didn't really play out that way in the industry. But it is essential, I think, to have a ground level knowledge of each of these technologies within your own insurance stack, within your own team. So when we're talking about AI, I think we're buying our AI partnerships and leveraging them into appropriate use cases for our platforms. We still need to have AI expertise, maybe not, level 10 guys who just left OpenAI, but we've got to have that foundational knowledge in order to even know how to implement such solutions in-house. So you become a better partner to the vendors that come in, because otherwise you don't really know how to build a reference database or how a large language model works. And you ask those questions that you should really be a little further along in actually working with a partner.
It's a great definition. I agree 100%. And I argue all the time that what we need are people who are good at like identifying and picking vendors and are good managers of vendors, more than we need people who like know how to build like everything in the world. And that's different. 15 years ago, that was not the case. But I do think like we're entering a period of time where there is a real need in an organization for expertise in like what is out there and how to bring things together and how to evaluate. But I guess, it's interesting. Like you like one of your examples was like how to build a reference database. Like, I guess I think of more of the AI expertise as being more like having a good intuitive sense of like, what are these good at? What problems are these good at solving? And what problems are they not good at solving? And less like technical aspects, which I would view as like, building the core database or like thinking about tokenization or things. I would think and I would think it is more about like what are they good at, because it keeps changing. And And so I do see a lot of organizations still focusing on a a view of technical good, and a lot of the people who are technically good at it really overstate, in my opinion, what is actually possible with like an LLM. So
I
anyway,
think that's true.
Oh, sorry, Josh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, Joe, I think you're exactly right. When I was saying build the reference database, I don't mean coding. Like, what is it? How does it get used to solve a business problem? But
Sure.
ultimately, we're getting to the same spot of there's some foundational knowledge in order to manage the relationship. That doesn't mean that you've got to go build your own, large language model. Those are two wildly different kinds of skill sets. One is appropriate for the business, and one is to go start a tech company.
But guys, it almost sounds like there needs to be so when you're thinking like staffing and talent. So Joe, as you were describing that, I'm thinking, well, you must be how are you hiring folks? Because it sounds like you need them to have a mental acuity beyond just like being able to code, being able to engineer, being able to evaluate vendors is a slightly different skill set, right? And it's also you got to make sure the vendor is on time. You might have to have difficult conversations with them. You have to collaborate here and there. So it's a different skill set. So it maybe around like making decisions around buy versus build. It's a staffing thing too. You have to have the appropriate staff to be able to do buy or build or hybrid or both. Like they just have to have a head on their shoulders and be able to think maybe abstractly or 30,000 feet and can also get into the weeds when necessary, kind of thing. How are you guys handling that?
I mean, we believe we believe that too many organizations worry too much about hiring people with specific talents and not hiring for like people who are curious and work in an environment. And so we're always happier to train into these things. And what's great is if you build in your company like a culture of this is how we talk to vendors, this is how we manage vendors, this is how we think about vendors, and that's built into your like third-party risk management and how you talk to people. It's actually very easy, I think, to train people how to think about this. So on the AI side, the vendor we work with, I took a couple executives who knew nothing about it. I told them to buy ChatGPT subscriptions, and then we just worked through a process. And so again, we're 18 months into it, and what I actually earlier today, I was asking them all sorts of questions about it. How are things going? How do you think about it? What's happening? And I'm getting some great answers from them about, okay, it's hallucinating too much in this context, and so we can't put it free to customers directly there. So my sense is with a lot of this, especially new technology, that it's certainly if it's like managing the vendors and learning how to think about it, that it's just about people with good critical thinking skills, and just and many people can be trained to do that effectively, especially if there are good models within the company. It perpetuates itself.
I think it's a really important point that you're making. This idea that if you're going to buy, can you really express, in fact, what you're looking for and the problems you're trying to solve for in a way that the potential set of companies out there solving for that can actually be a good fit. And I've seen that in the past where some companies are not great at expressing, in fact, what it is that they're looking for and what problem they have, and specifically how that can get solved for. And I think investing in that, whether it's people, as you say, Joe, or processes or both, I think can lead to really good buying decisions then on behalf of a company if you have kind of those processes and procedures in place.
Well, Adam, I think it circles back to the initial answer around, being able to clearly differentiate what it is you do, your solution set. I mean, look, Joe was able to like top of his head be able to rattle off the elevator pitch that they have. They know it and they know it deeply. And so Joe's able to take that from a technology standpoint and probably continue the differentiation. I agree with you. I've been on the consulting side. I've been on the other side, and I've interviewed, hundreds of startup founders, and it is amazing how often like I can understand their value proposition better than they can, right? Like, and it's sometimes it's because they're just so stuck in the weeds. They're juggling so many different things that it's not on the top of their head. But I think there's a critical lesson here around buy versus build. I think part of it goes back to who you are as a business, and can you clearly define who you are? What is it that you're doing? How is it that you're doing it? How is it different than others are doing it? If you, geez, I mean, if you can't clearly define that, and you can't clearly define what you're looking to buy, how are you possibly going to build something? What is it that you're going to build? You're likely going to build the wrong thing. So I see, I think that's probably a more common case than folks that are adequately able to communicate, buy the right thing, get the vendor on, or build the right thing.
Yeah, and maybe what comes to mind actually as you talk about that, Nick, if you think about what you're trying to solve for, it's probably a spectrum of things. And this notion that should we buy or should we build, could there be maybe almost like a middle ground of some kind of a hybrid approach where you look at the totality of what you're trying to accomplish, and some of it, in fact, might be we're going to build this component or this piece of it, and we're going to, quote, buy the rest. Do you think that's another viable way, Nick, to look at it, where it's not all or nothing, right? It's not, well, we have to buy it or we have to build it. Could there be somewhat of a hybrid approach, or have you seen that work, or have you considered that as you've talked to other companies about the idea of onboarding tech? Is there this middle ground? Did you see that work, or does that make sense?
Well, I think ultimately that is everything is hybrid at the end of the day. Like you can't buy everything. You can't, we've already discussed, you can't build everything. You're not going to have the resources or the talent or the time to be able to do that. So in many ways, it is a hybrid approach. And generally what I've seen, Adam, is, kind of picking and choosing which things they want to build. But like I feel like I'm still learning. I had an eye-opening discussion last week when we were, rehearsing for this, and Joe was talking. We had a full, all of us had a full discussion around policy management systems and whether you should build them. And it's like there's a lot of firms that are using modern technology. It's they're cutting edge in their policy management firms. And Joe brought up the particular use case that their firm needed something in particular. And so, they took the hybrid approach, and I had not really thought about that, but they built a component. And so, Joe, you can discuss it as much as you want, but I think it gets to, you have to really know what your firm can do, what they're good at, and as Josh said, like if it's some of the commoditized stuff that is not differentiating, it's not going to affect your intellectual property, it's likely you should just buy that and move quickly with speed. But even in those cases, there might be particular subcomponents that's quite not right for what we need. It's not going to enhance our differentiation. And while it will slow us down, we really have to build this because it's going to add to our intellectual property. It's going to differentiate us. And it's a smaller component. And we're not still responsible for building the whole thing. We're only responsible for this smaller component. So I think at the end of the day, I think firms that, folks that are listening here, I think that it is, not only is it a hybrid approach of do we build this thing and not this thing, but even in the thing that you're not building, there might be subcomponents you might have to build in, and vice versa.
And Josh, I imagine you see that every day, being head of innovation, trying to figure out what that map looks like, right? And then determining where do you lean in terms of more building internally of that spectrum of things versus looking to others.
It's exactly the struggle. And one of the challenges I think our IT partners all have is there are two different sets of unknowns. So when you go and you buy a technology as an end user, you see a finished shiny product that is, to the end user, just ready to roll out in-house. To the IT team, it's terrifying because they have absolutely no idea what configurations are going to look like, what customizations are going to be necessary, how API endpoints are going to work, because they didn't build it. From the IT perspective, they know exactly when they build it, how it's all going to play in with all of the core systems and the architecture. But the end user is terrified because they can't see what the end result was going to be. But the technical underpinnings are going to be right. So That balance leads to some interesting results. And coming to this point, the hybrid is kind of the answer that satisfies both people. Is how many of those things that are your special sauce could really be a microservice that plug into a more commoditized platform,
Yeah.
or could be integrated in some way where you can get, the chassis, but you've customized the engine. Like, there are ways to get there where you can alleviate the fear and the unknown on both sides and actually end up at an optimal outcome.
Yeah, I wanted to touch, there was actually a question that came through that I thought was interesting and kind of relevant to what we're talking about, in the sense that, well, who ultimately is the buyer of some of this? And I just had a conversation this morning with somebody about this, where they were running a business operation, made a decision to buy a particular software, but didn't kind of run it by the IT group, and they got very upset, and there became almost like a turf war, and then it got kicked down the road, and the problem they were trying to solve for got delayed, if you will. I don't know if any of you can speak to that. How do you make sure that all the constituents are contributing the way they should? Is there a process for that? Should it always start with IT and then move to business, or can it start in the business and then move to IT? Or is it, I don't know how you all think about that.
Yeah, this is a model of organization that's described in this Q&A that exists a lot, but it's not like this organizational structure is not built for speed to value, and it's not built for effective problem solving. So it's built for like a very specific kind of having these like specific departments and trying to have accountability. But I think the problem is, with software eating the world, and more companies are becoming software companies, and more how whether you can grow as a business, succeed as a business, or even survive as a business is about how you leverage technology. Mm-hmm. Then any business model that's like department, like functional departments, like IT departments, like that treats them like they're on different islands, is just ultimately not going to be able to compete with a company that is built to deliver technology effectively. And there's a great book. It's called Accelerate. It's the best book written about software development, I think, ever, and how to do it effectively. But here's the very short, I'll give you the shortest version of the book. If you're not shipping software multiple times a week, top tier. All of the top tier firms ship software to production multiple times a week. If you're not able to do that, you're not top tier. You're not able to deliver speed to value. It's just period. That's where you sit. And there are a bunch of things you have to do as an organization, including getting everybody on board and understanding that that's how you're good. That's how effective companies are, and that's how they need to work. And and it's possible. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people who work in the trenches. They're like, well, we could never do it here. And I think my question then would be like, well, 18 months ago, your company wasn't doing anything with AI, and now every executive is freaked out about AI and doing things about AI. So I'm pretty sure you can change. I'm pretty sure people can do stuff. Mm-hmm. And so it requires really effective leadership that can explain across the organization, usually in terms of like a dynamic CIO who is reporting to the CEO, who can go and help everybody understand, if we keep working this way, we're not going to be good at leveraging technology.
I agree with that mindset, but I wonder, Nick, do you think that also means organizations have to accept a certain level of risk, that if you're moving at that pace and you're pushing software live every single week, that it may not get it right sometimes? Is that part of the output of that kind of nimbleness and moving that fast? Or, I mean, is that what you kind of as an organization have to accept, is that, you might not get it right every single time?
Well, they have
organizations that slip really slowly get it right every time. Just like,
well, that's true too. I mean, that's a great point. Yeah, But you have to understand, I think there is that mindset, right? you take it slowly and you analyze it from 500 different, directions, we're probably going to get it more right than if we just keep moving at a pretty brisk pace. I've seen
Look,
that.
I hate cutting off Nick, but like if there's anything we've learned in the last 15 years, it's that excellent products come from frequent iteration off customers. And the reason why we abandon waterfall for agile generally, although most companies that say they do agile are still doing waterfall, they just renamed it. There's still, the idea that if a bunch of executives sit and spend 18 months and plan something, that it's going to be better than if I build something small, release it to people, get feedback and iterate on it. Certainly the effective CIO will be helping people understand the latter. But yeah, if you had an organization of people who are like, I'm a genius executive, I know more than anybody else, and getting me in a room with people for a year and downloading the wisdom of my brain, which is genius and amazing at usability, great at interaction design. It's great about design systems. It's great about how people intuitively work with things. It's great. I'm an expert in absolutely everything on the planet. If that's who you've got, then, you're screwed. Like that, you're going to be stuck. You're going to need people who can learn from data and learn from, what are the most amazing apps on your phone that you love and how are they built? Guess what? They were all built iteratively with feedback cycles from users.
Yeah.
Look at the version number.
It's hard to add to that. I think, the question that came in, those IT departments are working on waterfall type of methodologies. And I think we've all been through something like that. I've been overruled by an IT team that said we can build that, right? And then they can't, or they don't, or it's very late and it's still harming the firm. And so I think that is one thing we have learned with technology is it's rapidly changing, and humans' usage of it is rapidly changing as well. So if you're not being constantly iterative, you're actually falling behind, right? Because you might be falling behind like the technology, but you also might be falling behind the business use case, how the users are using it. I think that constant feedback loop is one of the advantages of digital technologies that we don't have in traditional engineering. When you're building a bridge, I mean, you have to learn from bridges that collapse, and we go through great pains to make sure bridges don't collapse or planes don't fall out of the sky, and it takes many, many, many decades to get to a particular point around that. And I think that is one of the advantages that we have, and why I think firms should become more digitally oriented. Is it's that feedback loop gives you so much information about how people are using things, how people are not using things, whether your hypotheses are correct or not, right? Like in Adam, I think business is risk, right? So I think every decision you make has some degree of risk to it. I would rather know quicker and sooner that I was wrong, but there are egos at play, and I do think, as Joe said, I think these departmental structures are from an older era and an older, it's old MBA type of here's how you need to structure a business. And I think we're in a, we every 50 to 100 years we go through like a new cycle of like what business is supposed to be. And that's an old school of how things are going to be done. I think the way digital companies have been structuring themselves, they still get it wrong, right? Like there's still risk there. They're still getting it wrong, but they're learning quickly and they're fixing it. And then it's like flying a plane from New York to California. You don't get the initial direction correct at the beginning. Like you're constantly course setting until you make the landing. And I think that's what business is. And I think digital technologies have instructed us at how little we actually knew, in our traditional businesses.
Yeah. And Josh, I imagine as you're innovating at Axis, speed is one of the things you think about often. Does that does that tend to push you more into a buy scenario just because it might be faster to buy than to build? Or I'd just be curious how you're thinking about speed and
So
iteration.
Nick made the analogy at one point about building a bridge, and we want a bridge never to collapse. And I thought it was interesting because all I kept thinking is, I'm like a bridge. where, and this doesn't directly reflect on Nick's point, but unlike a bridge, you expect a bridge to be up for 100 years. Like the Brooklyn Bridge was,
Yeah.
built by hand. I want to be able to plug and play vendor technologies as quickly as possible because, one day this workbench is great and the next day the next workbench is great. And, obviously with there's work involved, so you can't change that quickly. But I don't want to be in this environment where, well, we signed up for this platform and for the next decade, we can't evolve our business methodologies or update our processes because we're stuck on XYZ platform. Unlike the bridge, I want to see speed. I want to see our team be able to access our data because our data is properly structured, build API endpoints, and then bring in the best technology for that block of time. I would be very upset if I implemented some solution at Axis and came back in 20 years and it was still there. Like that is not a win. That's not a good thing by any stretch. Technology evolves too quickly for that kind of thinking. It comes back to the question that was posed. Should the solutions be coming from IT or the business? Both. I certainly wouldn't want IT coming to the business and saying, here's your new solution, enjoy it. Similarly, it is not the business unit who has the expertise to say, how does this play in our architectural plan? Does this, comport well with the overall vision for the company? There's a collaboration that has to happen and understanding we're going to keep evolving. These things are going to keep moving. How do these pieces all merge that we're creating a functional system where our data flow is correct and we're actually able to deliver the value that each of these components can possibly deliver.
Yeah.
That's a more than one person lens.
No doubt. Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. I feel like I'd be remiss if we didn't touch on one aspect of, I think, this conversation that is really important, and that's just cost or total cost of ownership. And Joe, I think there's one thing where you can look at it and go, well, here's the price tag, if you will, maybe a license fee, but that's just sometimes the tip of the iceberg, right? In terms of what it may cost over time. Or can you share any thoughts on how you evaluate cost and maybe ROI and how does that play into buy versus build? Or I think people would appreciate just some thoughts on that, right? Just this idea of how do you evaluate that from that perspective? Because that is a consideration for sure.
I'll plug my book. Read this great book called Serverless as a Game Changer. Chapter 2 is all about this. It's really, from my perspective, here are the most important aspects of doing cost. So first of all, there is a whole area of accounting called cost accounting, right? So you have direct costs, you have indirect costs, you have opportunity costs, you have fixed costs, you have variable costs, you have sunk costs, you have controllable costs. And in my experience, when you're buying, it tends to be pretty easy to know what the costs are going to be. It tends to be pretty full formed. And I know when I say buying, I don't mean like paying Accenture to build software for you, but I mean like if you go buy Salesforce, like you can get you're pretty good at now you're going to miss on some parts probably, but you're pretty good at figuring out what the costs are up front because you can talk to other people who've done it. You can hear what the pitfalls are. You can go plan for contingencies. All that works really well. When you build it, my experience is, one, it's very common for organizations to think that the future cost of internal labor is a sunk cost. It is not. It is actually an opportunity cost. And so often it is underestimated. And there is often a jockeying of executives who sort of think of like, oh, the way I will prove I am the more important executive is I will take more development power. Not necessarily if that helps the company at all. I think it's also really common to underestimate the direct cost for internal labor, largely through poor estimation. I'm sure we've all had the software project that was estimated at 3 months that was not done 15 months later. That is a terrible error in cost accounting, and yet it is routinely there's no adjustments made for it or no contingencies made for it. Actually, one of the things that I've seen more frequently recently is cases where there was a problem. It was given in spec to an IT team or a development team, And then in order to hit the cost, they dumped features. So it didn't solve the problem, but they finished the work on time. Those are things that I think happen a lot here. And then one other thing that I see a lot is people are bad at estimating the variable costs for cloud infrastructure, which is just true, but it's difficult. And so that can be a challenge. I'll leave you with this one observation as well, which I write about in the same chapter is, and we've talked about it here as IP. Are you building IP? It's common for people to think about the code they write as an asset. We wrote this code, it's an asset. Maybe it's a trade secret. Look at this thing we have that nobody else has. Code is a liability. You have to maintain it. And the best way to understand that the software code you write is a liability is to think about what it's doing. So if you have code that does something, or you can buy something that does something, there's no, as doing the same thing, it's the same asset, right? It's not different from an asset perspective, but it's very different from a cost perspective, because if you wrote that code, you have to maintain it. You have to make sure it runs. You have to make sure it's compliant with security. You can't make sure that, a new security vulnerability can't hack it. If you're paying somebody else for that, they get to deal with all that stuff. And so, understanding that code is a liability is a very useful framework when you're thinking about all of these costs as well.
Yeah, I think cost accounting is. I've seen so many projects where, Joe, the cost accounting was done at a very superficial level. So, like you said, you kind of know what you're going to get when you buy, and then when you build, it's just like, oh well, it'll take these two developers, roughly 20 hours a week for this period of time. And there's not that deeper. It's hard to go into the indirect costs. What's it going to take to maintain this? It almost feels like, well, we'll just, maintaining it. What is that? It's just we're tweaking the code, right? Like or something like that. And it's clearly much more. In my experience, it's always like 100% of the time. It's always much more than that. You can never kind of sit on it and just say this is the bridge. This is going to last 100 years. This is done. It's never done. Right. So I think cost accounting becomes just like, I wish firms would take the cost accounting element to this particular decision to the same extremes that they take other financial decisions, where they are like doing this massive evaluation and vetting and due diligence on it. It almost feels like buy versus build should be like, well, we should be able to make a decision in a relatively short period of time. And I think part of it goes back to what we started at the beginning. It's like, who are you? What do you do? What is your differentiator? Right? Like it's very important to know who you are in order to be able to go to, you may not even have the culture to be able to do the cost accounting in the appropriate way. So Adam, when you brought up risk, it's like, that's risk. Yeah. That's real risk. And you don't even know you're bringing it onto yourself. Kind of risk. So I think Joe, I'm not shilling your book, but anywhere where you can like learn about proper cost accounting, I think that's just absolutely critical.
I read an article, and I don't have it in front of me, so don't quote me exactly on the stat, but it was like, if you build software internally, you should expect 20% of your overall development time to be your per annum maintenance time, and then amortize that out as a part of your overall costs. Because I don't think that maintenance cost is ever included.
I would also tell you that my experience, and this is largely working in companies that view their differentiation through technology, but I've never seen a software project that didn't spend more each additional year of its life. So like I guess, and you're right, like maybe that's the right way to think about that piece of it, but I do think in the world of software as a service, and when we build things forever, I think in general, you just keep throwing more resources on it because it keeps paying dividends if it works. Obviously, I think you're right. If you're like, we're done with this thing, but we have to keep the lights on, I think that 20% sounds like a good estimate.
Oh, that's before you talk about any enhancements. That's just maintaining the code base and ensuring that you don't have a major software vulnerability. I have never seen a project that didn't have an enhancement budget to infinitum for the rest of the time that software is in place. It's not cheap.
Yeah, and as I think you're all saying, it doesn't always age well, right? I mean, the whatever you built initially as the MVP or solving a problem doesn't always iterate as well as third-party software, because you just have to keep investing in it to stay ahead of the game. So
software is milk, not wine.
That's right. It does spoil.
Yes.
I know we only have a few minutes left. I thought maybe we could end. You all have enormous experience in this realm. And Nick, maybe I'll start with you. I don't know if you have any anecdotes or anything you'd want to leave the audience with, just in terms of this buy versus build, or some last thoughts about what people can take back to their organization so they're just smarter about this whole thought of helping the organization be better, onboarding tech in the most efficient, effective way. So I don't know if you had some parting thoughts.
Yeah. I think having some rules of thumb are going to be useful to you, but I think at the end of the day, I think it gets to, what is the DNA of your organization, right? Like if you don't understand who you are and what your culture is, you just, yeah, you can make water go uphill, but it's going to take a lot of energy to be able to do that. It's a lot easier to make it go downhill, right? And so you should be building around using gravity as a force for good, right? Versus trying to do that. And I see way too many firms just trying to fit square pegs into round holes. It's like, if there's a will, there's a way. And yes, and in many ways I do kind of believe some of that. But if you are running counter to who you are as an organization, if you think you can build and you like don't have the talent, can't afford the talent, like you're just kidding yourself. And I think that's a big part of it. And so there are no rules of thumb that are going to help you, right? If you don't know who you are, you don't know what you do and how you do it and how you do it differently and how you stand out. If you can't solve just like your overall business strategy, then rules of thumb might keep you in survival mode for a little while. But I think at the end of the day, I think the folks that I've seen that have been really successful, they know who they are, and in many ways they're ruthless, and it turns people off in some ways. But I think that's almost what you need as well. So that's kind of my parting thought.
Yeah. Josh, did you have some final thoughts here?
Oh, so many. I mean, the one that gets me is when we do these discussions, there's always the CBA. Every company wants what's our internal, what's our external cost and analysis. There are hundreds and hundreds of articles that tell you it's more efficient, more cost effective to buy these commodity softwares and only build differentiators. Like, that is not me saying something brilliant. That is, pick an article that says basically that point. Uh, I think that should be the starting place, and it should really be incumbent upon the build side to justify why this has to be a build. We've got to shift to buy as the default position. If it's a build, really want to get onto the why. And the second point in that is, don't let the edge cases throw off your analysis on either side. Your IT team will tell you, hey, we can build for that edge case. And believe it or not, they can. But do you want them to spend 50% of the overall project budget building for the edge case? Whereas you can say the third-party software doesn't handle the edge case. Maybe that's a really good thing. Maybe you need to eliminate the edge cases, or maybe you just saved yourself 50% of your budget by not dealing with the edge case. And very often I see the edge cases being determining factors in an acquisition or a strategy or a build versus buy. And you really got to hone in on, is this our business method? Or is this that 2% thing that comes up here and there and we should maybe just eliminate?
Very, very good advice. And yeah, definitely worth thinking about. Joe, I'll let you have the last word. We have a couple minutes here. I don't know if you had any last parting thoughts.
Those are both great. I totally agree with what Josh is saying there, that too many businesses aren't willing to think about changing their process. And you're right. If you go out into the market and no software supports your process, think about changing your process. Probably it's not a good process. I've got two other thoughts on this. One of them is this is sort of on the hybrid approach comment, but I think that there is this belief that you kind of build the whole thing or you buy the whole thing. And one of the things that's really changed in the last 20 years of building software is that we have all these component API services that mean that what you actually have to build when you build an application can be very, very small. And this is how Branch has been able to do this with 13 developers. But for example, you want to send text messages, there's a service for that. Do you want to send programmatic email campaigns as part of your software? There's a service for that. Do you want full text search as a service for that? Do you want to infinitely scale all of your, all of your compute and everything you do and all of your databases without ever having to worry about it? There's a service for that. Do you need to resize images? Do you need to extract content from PDFs? Blah, 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 blah. There's a service for all of these things. And most developers come from the standpoint of saying, oh, there's code I can use for that, or the code I can write for that. And so, which leads me to the final observation, which is there's no continuing education in IT or tech. And so your tech leaders, sadly, probably last built when they were in college or right out of college. And they have not been forced to learn anything new about how anything works. Now, look, in real estate, you have to take annual continuing education classes. But I guarantee you, I could take a realtor from 1950, drop them in today, and they could be a realtor today without much training at all. But I could not take a single person who wrote software in 1950, and they would not be able to do a single thing today. In software, in tech, every 18 or so months, there is a meaningful change that makes it easier, faster, cheaper, better to deliver technology to users. Your technology leadership almost certainly has missed every single one of those innovations, unless they've been drag kicking and screaming into it since they were in college, when they probably did know those things. So you should be skeptical. You should push on it. And it's very likely that what you see out there that can be bought, if you're being told you need to build it, you're also being told you need to build it from the perspective of unfrozen caveman tech person from 15 to 20 years. And that's terrifying.
I think that's a great place to leave it. And thank you all, those that participated on the other end into our panel. I think this was a great discussion, and probably one you can see we probably could have gone on for another hour. There's a lot to talk about here, but thank you to the panel. I learned a lot, and I appreciate your time today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. And for everyone that attended, we got a list of everybody, so we will draw a raffle for the swag, and we will connect with you directly.
Thank you for that reminder, Nick. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.